Hi. The largest number of Buddhists today belong to the Mahayana division, which is predominant in East Asia. In contrast to Theravada Buddhism, which was the subject of the previous lecture, Mahayana Buddhists worship the Buddha as a god, they look to bodhisattvas for assistance, and they consider enlightenment to be something that can be attained by ordinary believers in this lifetime, not just monks and nuns. This form of Buddhism had its origins sometime between 100 before the Common Era and 100 of the Common Era, but there's no founder of Mahayana Buddhism. Instead, there are new sacred texts that begin to appear anonymously in India during those centuries. These texts offered a slightly different take on the teachings of the Buddha. Now, some monks accepted these new writings as authoritative and scriptural, and others didn't, though they recited the same vinaya, like the pratimoksha that we talked about before. They recited that same pratimoksha together, and they often lived side by side in the same monasteries. For a long time, Mahayana Buddhism was a minority movement. It may be that the origins of Mahayana Buddhism had something to do with the decision to commit the Theravada scriptures to writing in the 1st century BCE. Remember that written sacred texts were something of an innovation in India at the time. Hindus and early Buddhists had long held to the superiority of scriptures that were memorized and handed down from teacher to disciple or from monk to monk, and then recited aloud. Transmitting oral texts through the centuries was definitely a collective project, with monks constantly teaching each other. They were memorizing and chanting. And then they were correcting the recitations as they were being made. A scripture needed to achieve widespread acceptance and consensus in order to survive. It has to be memorized, and that takes time, and monks do that together. But writing gave text more of an independent life. A single monk working alone could create and refine a lengthy sutra, and then it could be spread far and wide without having to be memorized. That is, without having to be transmitted slowly and laboriously and personally from a teacher to a student. A text that doesn't have to be memorized may lose something in immediacy, but it gains a great deal in portability, and it becomes much more accessible to laypersons who don't have the luxury of being able to study scripture and meditate full-time. Altogether, there are about 100 major Mahayana sutras. The earliest Mahayana sutras were concerned with the perfection of wisdom. These writings claim to offer deeper insights into the meaning of the Buddha's teachings, or Dharma. The first of the texts seems to have been the Sutra of Perfect Wisdom in 8,000 lines. So that's a pretty good-sized book. But there were later versions of the Sutra of Perfect Wisdom in 18,000 lines, and then one in 25,000 lines, and there was even a version in 100,000 lines, which was actually a very repetitive version of this text. These sutras all purport to convey the words of the Buddha. They all start out, "Thus have I heard," when the Buddha was staying at such and such a place, and then they go on. But then they explain how being a bodhisattva is superior to being a disciple. Ordinary disciples were assumed to simply want to gain enlightenment and to escape from this cycle of suffering and death and birth and death again. They wanted to escape from that cycle for themselves, while bodhisattvas became enlightened, and then rather than moving on into nirvana, they renounce that stage until they have assisted every other sentient being in attaining the same liberation. So they undertake this great act of self-sacrifice, this staying in this world order, for the good of others, and hence they exhibit perfect compassion. There are actually 6 perfections that characterize bodhisattvas. The first is perfect giving, and then perfect morality, perfect patience, perfect exertion, perfect meditation, and finally, perfect wisdom. If these qualities seem utterly beyond you right now, then the sutras suggest that you can make a vow along the lines of something like, I vow that if I ever attain enlightenment, I won't immediately pass into nirvana, but instead, I promise that I will become a bodhisattva for the sake of others. Okay, just that intention is enough to get a person started on the bodhisattva path. And then you can begin working on those perfections at whatever pace you can muster. Those are really lovely virtues. These are the kinds of lists that we encounter constantly in Buddhist texts, and they're worth thinking hard about. So is there anything missing from those 6 perfections? Is there any overlapping? Do we need all 6 of them? Are there any surprises there? So once again, the perfections that you would be looking for as a bodhisattva, a future bodhisattva, are giving, morality, patience, exertion, meditation, and wisdom. The point is that you would, by making that vow, be aiming for enlightenment, not for selfish reasons, not to free yourself from hardships and from sorrow, but rather in order to end the suffering of all beings throughout the universe. Okay, perfect wisdom, and I'm talking now about something that's attained by meditation rather than by logical analysis. Perfect wisdom means seeing things as they actually are. And in Mahayana Buddhism, this means recognizing that reality is beyond language and beyond human concepts such as being and non-being. Indeed, nothing has a self-existence or a permanent identity or form. Instead, by meditating, one can come to an intuitive understanding that all things are intrinsically empty. That is to say, they're empty of a permanent existence or self-existence. There's really nothing there, which means that there's nothing to hold on to and there's nothing to desire. Okay, and you can see how this would tie into the third noble truth. Remember that suffering comes from desire, and the third noble truth is that if you stop desire, you can stop suffering. And if you realize that there's really nothing to desire and no being that actually has desires, then it would be easier to bring those desires to a cessation. Indeed, taken to its logical limit, perfect wisdom says that there's ultimately no such thing as the Buddha, the Eightfold Path, bodhisattvas, or even enlightenment. All such phenomena are empty. They're all caused by other things, and it's all, they only have temporary existence. Sometimes, these perfection of wisdom texts can be rather obtuse, and they often go on and on. For example, here's an excerpt that relies on a pun. In Sanskrit, the word perfection is paramita, and it means to have gone to the other side or beyond. So, now the quotation, what is the perfection of wisdom? With regard to the perfection of wisdom, there is nothing on this or on yonder shore. If one could, with regard to the perfection of wisdom, apprehend this or the yonder shore, the Tathagata, meaning the Buddha, would explain this or the yonder shore of the perfection of wisdom. Since, however, this shore of the perfection of wisdom cannot be apprehended, one cannot explain its beyond either. It's a paradox to use more and more words to try to explain something that's ultimately beyond words. But there are some interesting insights that come from this type of analysis. If everything in the end is emptiness, then they're all, from some ultimate perspective, equivalent. There's really no difference between the things that we make human distinctions about, that we get so wrapped up about. This is the doctrine of non-duality, which is illustrated in a story from a famous Mahayana sutra called the Vimalakirti Sutra. It was written about 100 CE. Vimalakirti was a layperson, not a monk, but an ordinary person, a Buddhist, not an ordinary person, but he's a lay Buddhist, who taught the Dharma so authoritatively that the Buddha sent some of his disciples to go talk with him. Through a series of dialogues, we see Vimalakirti's understanding surpasses theirs, and indeed, it's only equaled by that of the Buddha himself. These debates are witnessed by disciples, by bodhisattvas, by gods and goddesses. At one point, a goddess showers heavenly flowers upon all the spectators. Those that hit the bodhisattvas simply bounce off and they fall to the floor, but they stick to the bodies of the Theravada monks. One of the most advanced of these monks, named Sariputra, tries to pull off these blossoms, since monks are not allowed to wear decorative items. Remember that from the Vinaya. But he can't pull them off. And when he asks the goddess why this is, She explains that the disciples still make distinctions between worldly and unworldly things. But because the bodhisattvas have gone beyond these conceptual categories, because they realize that all things are empty, they're completely indifferent to the flowers, and thus none of them sticks to them. Similarly, there is ultimately no difference, no real difference between life and death, between enlightened and unenlightened beings, or even between samsara, reincarnation, and nirvana, extinction. Shortly thereafter, we're still in this Vimalakirti Sutra, when Sariputri asks her, the goddess, why she doesn't give up her female form. He assumes that women would want to be men if they had the power to choose. So he says, why are you still in female form if you can do anything? And she responds, not with words, but by switching bodies with Sariputra, who as a monk who's been restraining his desires for many years, finds it very disconcerting to suddenly be within a female body. The goddess explains that gender is emptiness as well, and quotes the Buddha as saying, in all things, there's neither male nor female. Later on in the sutra, the Vimalakirti challenges 32 bodhisattvas to explain non-duality, that sort of difficult concept. And they all take a turn, each trying to best the last one. Finally, the Vimalakirti himself offers his contribution, which is to say nothing. And Manjushri, a bodhisattva famous for his transcendent wisdom, says, excellent. This is indeed the entrance into the non-duality of the bodhisattvas. Here there's no use for syllables, sounds, and ideas. This truth is beyond human language. There were several reactions to these sorts of Mahayana Buddhist texts. The first was simply puzzlement, like, where do these new scriptures come from, and how can they possibly be the words of the Buddha, seeing as how they've only just now appeared, 500 years after his death? Mahayana monks offered various explanations. They said these were the higher teachings of the Buddha, which he entrusted only to his most advanced disciples, and they've been hidden away safely in heaven, or in earthly caves, or even in the underwater palaces of dragon spirits until the present age. And now at last they've come forth. Or they might say, while the Theravada Sutras were heard and remembered by Ananda, these new scriptures were heard and preserved by celestial bodhisattvas, who are now revealing them again. So, for instance, the second chapter of the Lotus Sutra recounts how, just as the Buddha was about to teach the full Dharma, 5,000 monks and nuns and laymen and laywomen got up and just left because they were unable to comprehend his words. So he kept speaking, and they weren't around to hear it, but there were still numberless heavenly beings, bodhisattvas and Buddhas in multiple words, who heard the Buddha speaking at that time, and they preserved his words in a line of supernatural transmission, quite different from the memorizing monks behind the Theravada scriptures. Thus, monks in deep meditation might hear these teachings directly from celestial beings, from bodhisattvas that they beheld in visions. Okay, not everybody found these explanations convincing. An early Mahayana Sutra reports the reactions of its critics. So it's going to talk about people who are complaining about this sutra. And it says, these monks are arrogant. It's a great wonder indeed that they should give the name sutra to that which was not spoken by the Buddha, that which they made themselves and is a poetic invention, that which is a motley of words and syllables. Of course, that sutra will go on to talk about how those criticisms aren't correct, but they're acknowledging the fact that not everybody was on board with these new Mahayana sutras when they first appeared. Still, over time, the Mahayana sutras became more and more accepted, along with their distinctive doctrines of infinite compassion, of bodhisattvas, of multiple Buddhas in multiple worlds, of the Buddha nature that's within each of us, the emptiness of all phenomena, and the three bodies of the Buddha. So this is a theological innovation by which the Buddha can be thought to have gone into nirvana and thus be inaccessible to anyone in this world, but still the Buddha can be someone you pray to. So the idea here is that the Buddha has three bodies. The first is a transformation body. This is the physical, historical Siddhartha Gautama. The second is an enjoyment body, which is a heavenly Buddha who oversees pure lands and which believers can see and vision. And then a Dharma body is the third body of the Buddha, and this is the ultimate nature of reality. It's omnipresent, it's everywhere. It's the Buddha's truth body with no limits or boundaries. Indeed, some sutras, such as the Lotus Sutra, asserted that Siddhartha Gautama had become a Buddha eons ago, but he came to earth and pretended to be the disillusioned with his princely life. He gave it up, and then he pretended to gain enlightenment, and only then seemed to die and enter nirvana, all for the benefit of others. As the scholar Donald Lopez puts it, this was all a performance designed to inspire the world. Okay, this sort of theology answers some questions. How can one expect help from the Buddha if he's already passed into nirvana, for example? Though it created some other problems. As the Mahayana Sutras multiplied, so did the contradictions in their teachings. How could a Buddhist make sense of it all? The Lotus Sutra provided an answer in the famous parable of the burning house. And I'll just note for a moment, the Lotus Sutra is probably the most significant sutra in East Asian Buddhism. It's a primary scripture in several types of Buddhism that we'll hear about in just a little bit, with distinctive teachings about salvation and Buddhahood and proper worship, and there's lots of parables, and this parable of the burning house is probably the most famous of those. So the story is that there was once a wealthy man who had many young sons, and they all lived in a large house which had only one exit. One day, the house caught fire. The father saw the danger, but his sons were happily playing games and entertaining themselves, and the father realized that they wouldn't understand his warnings and that he couldn't physically go and grab them all and get them out of the house in time. So he told them that he had presents for them outside the gate, and knowing their childish desires, some of them he promised a cart that was pulled by a goat, and others he promised carts pulled by a deer, and still others an ox cart. Okay, if we were going to update this for the modern world, he might promise some of these kids tricycles, and some bicycles, and some pickup trucks, depending on how old they were. Okay, this promise of some carts, some vehicles outside the gate got their attention, and all the boys rushed out of the burning house. When they saw their father, he gave them all, actually all ox carts, and in our modern translation, that would be like he gave them all sports cars, let's say Maseratis or something. And then the Buddha, after telling this story, asked his disciple, Sariputra, "Did this man lie to his sons?" And Sariputra answers, "Not exactly. He got them all out of the burning house, and he gave each of them something much better than what they could have imagined." So it's not telling falsehoods so much as it's a case of what Buddhists call expedient devices or skillful means. In other words, the Buddha took whatever action was necessary to get the job done. Out of compassion, he tailored his message to each son so that he could save them all. Perhaps you can see where this is going, especially if you remember that the term Mahayana means great vehicle. The Buddha goes on to explain that this life is like a burning house, and he came into the world to save people from, as the sutra says, the fires of birth, old age, sickness, and death, care, suffering, stupidity, misunderstanding, and the three poisons. The three poisons are desire, anger, and delusion or ignorance. But most people are so caught up in their day-to-day concerns and activities that they have no idea what danger they're in. They don't understand the urgency and the need for them to be rescued and saved. So the Buddha offers people three vehicles: that of the Arhat, or disciple, and that's basically Theravada Buddhism, where you hear the teachings of the Buddha and then individually try to put it into practice by becoming a monk or a nun and then hopefully gain a nirvana. The second vehicle is that of solitary Buddhas. These are pretty rare. These are people who kind of figure out the Four Noble Truths on their own and then go into nirvana. And then that of the Bodhisattva. This is the Mahayana vehicle, which will allow great numbers of people to gain salvation. Each message applies to different types of people, but in the end, they all receive the same wondrous gift of enlightenment, of liberation from suffering. The moral of the tale is that the Buddha may have told some disciples one thing and other disciples another thing, so his words may seem contradictory, but his teachings are all nevertheless part of one great truth, the truth of Mahayana Buddhism, the one vehicle. So the Theravada scriptures aren't wrong, it's just that the truths they contain are only partial. But even if the theological contradictions could be resolved, at least to some degree, there remains the practical problem of a canon that includes hundreds of books, some of them quite long. Even monks and nuns who spend a lifetime in study couldn't master them all. And for Mahayana Buddhism, with its new emphasis on the spiritual progress of laypersons with families and jobs, the problem is even more acute. One response was to pick out a few sutras that were considered particularly insightful or advanced, and then focused on them as a sort of canon within the canon. Different schools of Buddhism championed different texts, but in East Asia, the Lotus Sutra became the most popular and most widely read of the sacred texts of Buddhism. The Lotus Sutra was originally compiled in the 1st century of the Common Era. It was first translated from Sanskrit into Chinese in the 3rd century, and then again much more accurately in the 5th century, the early 5th century, after which it became very popular, especially in Japan. In China, the Lotus Sutra was adopted as the key scripture of the Tiantai school of Buddhism, which then spread to Japan as the Tendai school. In Japan, it was adopted by the imperial family and cultural elites, and its message was spread through art and music, sermons, ritual performances, protective charms, and no drama, a very distinctive form of theater in Japan. Eventually, a Japanese monk named Nichiren, and he lives from 1222 to 1282. That makes him a contemporary of the Christian theologian Thomas Aquinas. Eventually, Nichiren made it the center of his new form of Buddhism, so much so that rather than reciting the traditional chant, "Hail to the Lord Buddha," or "Homage to the Lord Buddha," Nichiren taught his followers to look to the Lotus Sutra for salvation and chant, "Hail to the Lotus Sutra of the true Dharma." Today, Soka Gakkai, a Japanese lay Buddhist movement that has some 12 million members around the world, continues this practice of giving homage to the Lotus Sutra. As a side note, the Lotus Sutra was the first Mahayana text translated in its entirety into a Western language. There was a French translation that was done in 1852. Okay, another tactic for dealing with this massive amount of sacred texts in Mahayana Buddhism was, rather than focusing on a single text, one could take the expanding versions of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras and then try to distill the essence of them into something much shorter and more portable. So these shorter Perfection of Wisdom texts started to appear between 300 and 500 of the Common Era. So rather than the Perfection of Wisdom in 18,000 lines or 25,000 lines, you get the Diamond Sutra, which is about the size of a pamphlet. You may remember a few lectures ago when I talked about a 9th century copy of the Diamond Sutra that was found on the Silk Road at Dunhuang, that was the world's oldest dated printed book. This is also the text that the Chinese father burned as an offering to his small daughter who had died from smallpox. The Diamond Sutra consists of a dialogue between the Buddha and his disciple Subhuti, in which the Buddha explains again and again how the ordinary ways of thinking about Buddhism are undercut by the realization that all things are emptiness. The Buddha describes how a bodhisattva vows that he or she will lead all beings to final nirvana, but at the same time understands this. It says, "And yet, after I have thus delivered innumerable beings, not one single being has been delivered." The Buddha continues, "And why? If, O Subhuti, a bodhisattva had any idea of belief in a being, he could not be called a bodhisattva. And why? He's not to be called a bodhisattva for whom there should exist the idea of a being, the idea of a living person, or the idea of a living being, or the idea of a person." That is to say, someone with an enlightened mind knows that there are no selves to be liberated, no path to liberation, and no Buddha to show the way. There's nothing but emptiness. The Heart Sutra goes even further, reducing this esoteric wisdom beyond ordinary comprehension to a single page, which is recited daily by monks and lay Buddhists throughout East Asia. It says, according to the Heart Sutra, form is emptiness and emptiness is form. And then checking off the 5 aggregates and the full noble truths and so forth, it pulls the rug out from under all of them. The Buddha tells Sariputra in the Heart Sutra, where there is emptiness, there's neither form, nor feeling, nor perception, nor impulse, nor consciousness. Those are the 5 aggregates. No eye, no ear, or nose, or tongue, or body, or mind. No form, nor sound, nor smell, nor taste, nor touchable, nor object of mind, until we come to there is no decay and death, no extinction of decay and death. There's no suffering, no origination, no stopping, no path. That was the 4 noble truths. And there's no cognition, no attainment, and no non-attainment. It's hard to imagine what texts like these might have meant to the spirit of a recently deceased little daughter. But Mahayana Sutras are often associated with what scholars term the cult of the book. These texts were regarded as sacred objects, almost apart from their actual contents. They were seen as a physical manifestation of the Buddha, and copying them, or reciting them, reading them, hearing, explaining, or even holding them were regarded as actions that brought great merit. So the Lotus Sutra promises that anyone who copies the text, or pays to have someone else copy it, will live a trouble-free life, and after death will be reborn into a Buddhist paradise. The merit acquired from venerating these books could then be transferred to others. And we saw an example of that in that oldest printed text where Wang Jian transferred the merit that he would get for paying for the copy to be done to his deceased parents. The Diamond Sutra makes it even easier. There are immeasurable benefits for anyone who receives, recites, and explains to others just these 4 lines of the text. The 4 lines say, all conditioned dharmas are like dreams, illusions, bubbles, or shadows, like drops of dew or flashes of lightning. Thus should they be contemplated. Okay, just those 4 lines will get you a long way in your spiritual progress, according to the Diamond Sutra. You might be able to see a paradox here. Mahayana scriptures are objects of veneration and care. So there was incredible scholarly effort that went into studying and copying and translating and printing such works. But ultimately, they don't have value. The goal is to move beyond these texts. We'll see more of this in the next lecture when we take up Zen and Tibetan texts. But we can end with an example of what Mahayana Sutras meant in the life of one particular Buddhist. This is a Chinese nun named Daoyi who lived in the 4th century. Her story is recorded in The Lives of the Nuns, which is a text that was compiled around 516 of the Common Era, and which itself became part of the Chinese Buddhist canon. Daoyi was married and then widowed at a young age. She was only 22. And at that time, she decided that she would become a nun. And because she was bright and gifted with an excellent memory, she was able to recite by heart the Lotus Sutra, the Vimalakirti Sutra, and the Smaller Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, all 3 of which I've mentioned in this lecture. She understood the doctrines behind them and was able to explain their nuances and their subtle meanings. Okay, think of how unusual this level of learning and scholarship would have been for a woman in ancient China, or anywhere in the ancient world for that matter. When Daoyi heard about a large project in the capital to collect and translate and write commentaries on Buddhist scriptures, she moved there and became an expert in the Vinaya. Remember, those are the texts about regulations for monks and nuns. She gained an esteem not only for her learning, but also for her simple lifestyle and her humble demeanor. And then the biography says this: when Daoyi was 78 years old, she fell seriously ill. She even more fervently concentrated her mind and chanted the scriptures without becoming exhausted. But her disciples requested of her, we wish that you would try to find a treatment for this disease so that you might overcome your debility. And Daoyi replied, that is not a proper thing for a Buddhist disciple to say. And as soon as she had spoken, she died. To recover from a personal tragedy, to being, in this case, widowed at a young age, and then to live life fully and have the peace of mind to let go when the time comes. Perhaps that is indeed the perfection of wisdom.